So this is the flower with the stem textured. I made a few changes to normal maps on the petals, and I did have to make some modifications to the stem in order to get the maps to really show up correctly. One thing I ended up doing is if we go to the stem, well, I do also have it in a bend deformer. So if you do want to add that bit of bend, and since the petals are connected, you can really reshape that however you want, and the petals will still pretty much stay in exactly the same place. Add in a bend deformer. I'll just go ahead and hide the other one from the scene. And if we go over to the attributes, what we can do is I went ahead and set the X and Z to 100, and then the Y to 150. Go ahead and move that up just above the stem, because we don't want to bend below at the base. We don't want to twist around all weird. We're going to keep the Y-axis length, and that way it's deformed properly. And then you can just drag that into the stem object. So now when you select that deformer, you can grab the handle and in the model mode or object mode, move that around and deform it. So I'm just going to put mine back. And what I was talking about with the polygons, let's go ahead and take a look. What I had to do was reverse the normals of the leaves. So if we take a look, the normals are facing down on the edges of the leaves, and it really was the only way to get the smoothing to really show up correctly. I could probably go in to the inside and also flip those around. As you can see, because of the extreme angles, the shading is a little weird looking, and I also have basically the thongs no angle limit. So from above it does give kind of a strange shape, and that does show up a little bit in the render. But that can be pretty easily covered up with another object. For the most part, we really won't see it. What I also did was I went in and added a little more geometry around the base, because the way the texture is set up, these leaves are in a different selection, and it does cut off, and getting it to blend perfectly would take a little more time than is worth spending in order to match that up, unless I reconstructed the UV map, which wouldn't be all that difficult, but this seemed to be a pretty good solution. So I was able to kind of tuck the seam within that area of the object, so just underneath, and that worked out pretty well. So if you want to take a look at that flower object, I'll go ahead and take a look at the textures. And here in Photoshop are all of the image maps being used to create the stem along with the leaves. I've got a normal I created using the NVIDIA normal mapper. Actually, that is currently not going to show in my interface because I'm running the 64-bit version at the moment, and that only works in the 32-bit version of Photoshop. But this was based off basically this bump map I created, which was created from the alpha, which clipped out the leaves overall, and then I just ran a couple of styles, inner glow, inner shadow, in order to create this. And then using that height map, I was able to create this normal, which works pretty well for the leaves. The stem, we can see that transition into what is the red area up at the top. And if we take a look at the render again, you can see just that nice little transition in there, right up to the top of the flower. This was created just by using a couple of leaves from the leaves collection, and what I did was just modify some of the colors. I used one of my linear leaves, and then just modified the color and just kind of repeated it, did some clone stamping, and that worked out pretty well for the stem. I did also apply the exact same hue change to the top of the stem to get that red, as I did to change the leaf color of the main leaves. And now, without the alpha, this looks a little strange, because you can see some of the variations behind, which is basically a duplicate of the stem, and really trying to match it up along the base. So it didn't quite match perfectly, but it did have a pretty good transition. And then I just created, basically just using an overlay, because I just copied the same leaf over a couple of times, and then applied a color overlay with a black background in order to get the alpha. I also just used the black and white filter to create a diffusion map for those leaves. So you can go to Image, Adjustments, Black and White, and then you can pull out individual colors, which ones you want to be brighter, darker, and the black and white filter is really, really useful for creating any sort of diffusion or bump map. So I've also got a bump map set up for the stem, which I ended up using the surface blur on this object, or on this texture. Go ahead and show you how I did that. I went to Adjustments and the black and white filter. And because the overall look was very grainy, Control L, pull up levels, and you can see once we get the higher contrast, that grain and those speckles were just way too much to deal with for a bump map. So we go up to Filter, Filter, Blur, Surface Blur, and we can set a threshold amount, which will allow us to keep some of those finer lines and then adjust the radius of the blur. I ended up running this twice, a very minimal amount first, and then ran it again to really smooth it out until I got this bump map. So that reacts pretty well with the specular channel. If you take a look at the render again, we can just see those nice highlights around the edge of the stem. So other than that, it's a pretty straightforward texture setup. I do have the selection tags grabbing from different areas to create multiple materials out of this. So if we take a look at the materials, there's a leaf material, and then the stem material, and then I'm also using the leaf material again for that central area that we originally had set up to be its own tag, but really decided that it didn't need its own texture. So I just have each one of those maps just kind of selected from the same overall layer setup. It was just a lot easier to have one file to contain all the images, and then just go through the layer selections, click Select, and then you can choose which ones you want to use. So I just assigned the alpha and the leaf setup to the leaves, and then the stem and all the stem areas to that selection. So the material tags are also set up to be applied to those selections. We've got the one for the stem, and then just the two flowers covering the center selection and the leaf selection. So now we want to create some more flowers to create kind of a cluster that we can clone on top of trees or on the ground or really wherever you want. What I want to do is go ahead and create a null object in order to basically create a container. And this is going to be the main flower object. I'm going to go ahead and leave it blank for the moment, because what we need to do is first clone the stem. And we'll probably need to reassign the generator for the clones of the flower leaves, and we'll also won't be able to use render instances for the initial stem setup, just because otherwise you won't really be able to assign it to those polygon selections because they won't be active. So I'll show you a couple of things you can do. Let's go ahead and add another MoGraph cloner object. And this doesn't need to be any sort of object setup, but you easily could set that up, assigning it to a sphere object and then being able to squish that up and down would lower and raise the leaves, or the flowers in this case, and the stems, which can be pretty interesting. But I'm going to go ahead and stick with the radial, the X and Z, and we have render instances turned off, so that way we can create actual objects that we're really going to need for the clone. And I'm going to start by taking our stem object and just adding that to the cloner, which you can see several problems at the moment. One thing I'm going to do, I'm pretty sure the object axis is completely off. So I do need to change the object axis of the stem object so that it is by the bottom or wherever we want the clones to start from. So it would be the area that would be resting on the object that it's going to end up on. So whether a terrain or a tree, so we have that nice starting point. And as you can see, the petals are not being duplicated, at least not showing up in the right area. So if we go over to the flower, we're going to have to change the object to the cloner object. And you'll also notice that we still don't have those duplicates. And that's because the selection tag is not going to be, in this case, duplicated. Or it's possible that we just don't have one in the right area. So I'm going to go ahead and take a look just to make sure. And we're using the vertex. So in this case, what we would need to do is add in a connect object. And what we can do is take the cloner, stick it inside the connect object. We're also going to need to move our materials up to the top of the connect object. And the selection tag should still be preserved. Under the connect object, I'm going to turn off weld. And we do have the textures still showing. I may even need to just bring it onto the cloner, making sure that this is set up correctly. And I think there's a possibility that this might just be too complex of a setup with all the leaves and the way the textures are set up for this to work directly. Unfortunately, we do need the connect object in order to properly assign those selection tags. So what we're going to have to do instead of creating a cluster or a group of objects, well, one thing we could do is if we add the connect object, we could make it editable. Once we do that, though, we lose our ability to bend and deform the object the way we're doing it right now. So we do lose some flexibility, but it will allow us to create new tags. I'm going to go ahead and show you a trick and copy and paste just to create a duplicate of this object. And go back and add in another connect object, since I deleted the last one. Turn off that weld, and then add the cloner to it. And we'll put the tags back on the object. I'm going to set the Fong mode to manual. And now what I should be able to do is just make it editable. What's going to happen is it's going to create a lot of duplicates of all of the selection tags that we have. So what we need is to be able to combine them all, really relying on the most important ones. Or whichever ones are going to be the most time-consuming to reapply. Because what we have to do is go through each selection tag, unfortunately, and basically select all of the polygons and create new tags. So the trick I'm going to show you is before you make it editable, you can select the object, go into, let's say, the polygon mode, and we're going to select one of the tags. Let's select the leaves. And now switch to the model mode, and we can make it editable. So now when I select the polygon and switch back over to polygons, so when we select the stem, it's going to select all of those polygons that were just selected and duplicate that. I did have one polygon I left selected when I used the selection tag, which is why that's showing up. But this way what you can do is now create a new set selection, making sure that none of the tags are selected. So selection, set selection, and now we can apply material to that. For the most part, this gets pretty time-consuming. This method shouldn't be used for this type of object, but it can still be fairly useful with other types of objects that only have minimal tag amounts. So I'm going to go ahead and delete that and bring back our other object. And there are additional options. Since we're not rendering instances, we can actually make the cloner object itself editable. And once we make the cloner object editable, we're going to get copies of all of these objects, with the addition of all of the bend deformers and anything else added. Which means we need to either create several cloner objects to apply to all the tags, or we may be able to use just one tag if they all have the same name. We'll go ahead and try that out. It doesn't always work, so we're going to go ahead and change that to the cloner object, which is a null object which cannot have a selection. So we're going to go back, create a new connect object, take all of these objects and put it in there, and transfer over the textures, and we're kind of back where we started before. So at this point, it's really, as you can see for this object, clearly not a great solution. There are other ways we can do this, of course. I just did want to show you some of these options because you're not always going to be able to create the duplicates that we're about to create. So what we need to do is clone the clone, which means we also need that null object. So I'll put the stem in the null object, and we're going to take that flower and add that. And we're going to take a look in the attributes, and we do need to switch this back over to the stem. And we still have our petal selection. The materials are currently not showing up for the rest of the object, and that's because it's not in the cloner yet. Once we add it to the cloner object, since the tags are applied, we can automatically assign everything. Now, the restriction between the render instances and also having the actual objects is the amount of deformation we can make. Basically, the bend deformer cannot be independently modified throughout instances, and it will apply the same action. So we're going to use Displaced Deformer. I'm going to add that to the stem. And what I want to do is create some scaling and kind of squish them down. We could also use other effectors as well. I'm going to just take a look at the Displaced Deformer. And here I've just set up a simple noise on the stems, which is basically kind of making them bulge out. Not something that would be a final effector that I would use, but just to give you an idea of one of the restrictions, if we go up to the cloner object and turn on render instances, we're going to lose the world shading that I had set up, world space noise, because it's going to create duplicates of the same object. And unless you have actual objects being created, there's no way to really run that through, at least not with the Displaced Deformer. So what we can do is just use one of the other effectors. Step Effector will work quite nicely for this. Go over to the Step Effector and go ahead and select the effector. And you can see already we have a nice little scale automatically. So if we go to the Step Effector, by default it's set to that relative scale. We can create a step gap. If you want to have larger variations, as you can see. We can also set up a bit of rotation. And I'm also going to go into the cloner for the stem and adjust the radius. Because I don't want them so spread out. I want them actually really close, if not right on top of each other, because I am going to be connecting the base of this object to other objects. So if we can keep this minimal so that the connection can be pretty straightforward and look realistic once it's joined, that's basically the goal. So we're going to go back to that step effector, and we can modify, add a little bit of pitch. I'm going to take that scale and bring it down to 0.5, so there's not so much variation. Modify the step gap. Now we can also set that to an absolute mode. So we're basically saying that this value becomes absolute, and if we actually turn on the absolute scale, it will make a different type of modification. So if we go back to the cloner object, we can now add more instances. As you can see, the way the rotation is being set up, really don't have enough influence from the step effector to create the kind of randomness that we need. So if needed, go back to relative scale. It looks like that wasn't really doing what we needed to. I also am going to turn on render instances. We can make overall transformation, but the step effector is a very subtle change overall, and it's not going to give us the kind of effect that we would get from the random effector. And granted, we could do some pretty cool stuff with it. Even setting up animation for this, pretty interesting. So let's go ahead and add in the random effector to control the rotation. So not the scale, just the rotation. Scale I still want to have controlled primarily by the step effector. And now we can adjust the rotation of the random effector and also make sure that that random effector is added to the effectors list. And then we can adjust our clones. And we've got a nice little cluster of flowers here. So we can also choose to add in some leaves on the bottom if we wanted. I had just grabbed the leaves from that tree and added that in to the scene. If I dropped this into the cloner object, we can have these leaves being cloned with the flowers. And in this case, the scale is a little bit off, and also the rotation, so I need to make some adjustments to both. But that way you can also clone some leaves on the bottom along with the flowers. I'm going to go ahead and leave those out of the scene for the moment. We can just stick with the flower object. I'm going to go ahead and select the bend deformer, and making sure we're in the model mode so we can see the handle. We can go ahead and make the adjustment to bend those whichever way we want. And we can see that modifying the entire object, which is pretty nice. So for minimal animation, that would be close up. We're not going to be animating everything to be exactly the same. This would actually work quite well for animation. Now once these get as close as they are, too many of the petals I think are touching, kind of overlapping, going into each other. So what I want to do is go into that step effector, grab the scale, and we can go ahead and increase the variation. We could also decrease step gap to add more variation throughout the parameters. Also, taking down the minimum amount will give us some smaller flowers on the bottom. But you can see the step effector is great for this kind of descent of scale. There's a lot of different ways to control that. I can make it a little more random if needed. With the remap, what we're getting is a lot of very, very small variations. It's really going to depend on how you're using it. We can also control the max amount, so you can see how that scaling is changing. And I'm going to turn off uniform scale and set the scale for the Y to 1. And that way what we can do is stretch the stems out a bit more. Keeping in mind it is going to also stretch the petals because it is part of the cloner. So if we need to, maybe we can reduce that a little. And I'm going to reduce the count down to about 6. And maybe we'll bring it up to 7. So that way we've got 7 flowers. We can adjust the angle if we're having any trouble with overlapping on this specific object. But also keep in mind that this is pretty much going to be almost static because we are rendering the instances, and if we were to clone this any further, I'm not sure if I'd really want to render the actual objects or have them in the scene, because it's going to end up to be a lot of polygons. So just kind of look for something that's going to look good throughout the entire scene. Something that'll be able to cover an object, but not look entirely like duplicates. Which is why we've got these different deformers in here to really make some nice modifications. I'll go ahead and increase some of these values for the pitch, and the bend, and the heading. And then we could also maybe step up the count and add more flowers. So this would be great for a ground object, but I also want to add this to the tree we were working on earlier, and have some nice blooms on that overall tree. We can also adjust the bend object and pull it up a little more or down to spread out the object a little bit if needed. There's also the fall off options that can still be set. So quite a bit we can do with that. I'm going to go ahead and save this out, and then we can bring it into the other scene with the tree and start taking a look at the different types of population with multiple objects within a cloner. Because then things start to get really interesting, and there's a lot more we can do with these clones. And I just want to show you a quick render of what this looks like. Basically, it has a few problems. None of the flowers are connected in the right place. In the editor, it shows up correctly, but not within the render. So there's two solutions for this. One is to cache the MoGraph instances, which we can do by adding in MoGraph cache tag. And under the attributes, we can choose to bake it. And now we can also see the same problem. So because deformation objects like the bend deformer do tend to have some trouble with MoGraph, and since we really don't have any variation of the object, the bend deformer doesn't need to be left in there. If you're creating variations, then keep it in there, but what the best thing to do is to create an object from the current state. So current state to object, and then use that new object to be the stem and not the one with the bend deformer. But you can leave the bend deformer available in another scene so that you can be able to create your own variations and some additional types of flowers. What I'm also going to do is I can scrub through the timeline and rebake. And now I might be able to get the flowers showing correctly. It does look like that's really not going to be a great solution. So even moving through the timeline, just the way that's set up, didn't really work. So I'm going to have to create a current state object for that stem. And then what we could do is just replace the stem, take out the other stem as a backup. Let's get rid of the null. And let's go ahead and get rid of the cache object. And I also need to drag in the new stem object to replace the other stem object because it's still trying to connect to the old one. So just go ahead and replace that. Remembering now that that bend is going to be constant. So what we can do beyond this is really just change the random effector for the heading and the pitch. And those are going to be our main modifications. But we can see in the render that everything is looking correct now, with the exception to the fact that I don't have ambient occlusion turned on anymore, which is why the flowers are a little bright. I did have that set up earlier for one of the renders, but currently have that turned off. So I haven't adjusted the material to tone that down. So we're going to go from here and create a group from these clones to be able to bring into the other scene. So the objects we're going to need are any sort of effector, a deformer. It's also a good idea to start adding some names in here. So flower, sizer for the step effector, flower rotate for the random effector. The other random effector is the petal sizer, because we don't want to have any duplicate names, because that could start to cause some problems. And then we'll call this flower stem. So now we have the sizer, rotate. The cloner object itself and the null object should also be renamed. So the null object is the flower flower A, and then I'll call this flower cluster A. So it is at least a little different. And now we're going to create a new null object to be able to bring this over into the other scene. And I've just named that flower group A. Take all of those objects, put them within the null, and now we have an object that we can move around between scenes. Or if we remove everything else in the scene, or just set up the individual object, we can set up the xref and just call from one of the other scenes directly from this object, so we don't even have to load it into the other scene, which is also a possibility.